It seems like it's taking one of the most hotly contested subjects in the world at the moment and raising the prospect that you'll go to prison, possibly for life, for saying it. And one question.
Welcome to the Quillette Podcast, Video Edition. I'm Jonathan Kay. And today I present my interview with Atlantic magazine writer Conor Friedersdorf. It's an interview I arranged after reading Conor's eye-opening June 6 Atlantic article entitled Canada's Extremist Attack on Free Speech, in which Conor analyzes an ominous new Canadian bill making its way through Parliament. That bill, known as the Online Harms Act, would allow the government to throw people in jail, potentially for the rest of their lives, if found guilty of promoting genocidal hate speech. The Online Harms Act would also allow the government to throw citizens in jail, again, potentially for the rest of their lives, if a court finds that they were motivated by hatred in contravening any act of Parliament. Worst of all, from a civil liberties point of view, Justin Trudeau's Online Harms Act would allow government to haul people before tribunals on suspicion that they might say something hateful in the future. If that sounds like science fiction, yes, you've probably seen at least one movie with that plotline. Needless to say, this legislation has attracted lots of criticism in Canada, including from none other than famed novelist Margaret Atwood. But I was surprised to see that its provisions are so draconian and so alarming to defenders of free speech that the bill is even getting attention in the United States. Indeed, in Conor's June 6th article, he wrote this of Justin Trudeau, his Justice Minister, Arif Virani, and their Liberal colleagues. And I quote, "No one who favors allowing the state to imprison people for mere speech, or severely constraining a person's liberty in anticipation of alleged hate speech they have yet to utter, is fit for leadership in a liberal democracy. Every elected official who has supported the unamended bill should be ousted at the next opportunity by voters who grasp the fraught, authoritarian folly of this extremist proposal." End quote. For more on Justin Trudeau's Online Harms Act, here is the author of those words, Atlantic magazine staff writer Conor Friedersdorf.
I saw that the Attorney General of Canada tweeted something about needing the ability to stop hate crimes before they happen, or something with that phrasing just struck me. And I thought to myself, what do you mean stop crime before it happens? Is this some kind of science fiction law that you're referring to that you're going to pass? And so I just kind of Googled around for a minute, and I saw that, the Online Harms Act has been debated for a long time. And, I had heard about it in the context of mandates on platforms about what their responsibilities are for what people post and don't post. But I hadn't realized when I think Elon Musk might have been tweeting about it. That could have been how I heard about it. I hadn't realized that there was this other aspect to it. And as soon as I started Googling and Twitter searching a bit, I saw that I think Fire had put out a statement, and a couple other free speech affiliated organizations or people who I generally trust on those issues had raised alarms. And so I started doing some reading. And at first, the tenor of the objections were so extreme that I thought, I wonder if I'm going to find that when I read the text of the legislation myself, I'm going to be a bit less alarmed if it's being oversold a bit. In this case, I found no. I was astonished by what I was reading. In fact, before I even got to the part about preventing a crime before it happens, the parts of the bill that ostensibly were going to try and do that, I saw the direct quote was something like, if you advocate for genocide, you're liable for a life sentence in prison. And I thought, wow, a life sentence in prison for mere speech. And I assume that people regularly get less than that after murders or rapes in Canada. It was just astonishing to me that these provisions that were right there in the law that government officials were defending.
Justin Trudeau's Liberal government did something clever here where they lumped in laws against child porn and stuff that everybody hates and wants banned. And it makes it difficult for conservatives to object to it. On the other hand, other parts of the law are clearly animated by what might broadly be called sort of anti-racism type speech prohibition. So from an anti-speech point of view, it's kind of like something for everyone. Is there any possibility this kind of law would be constitutional in the United States?
No. It certainly would trample on the First Amendment, and I don't think that you could. So to back up a bit, the provision that makes it a life sentence in prison to advocate genocide would certainly violate the First Amendment. The provision that would convene a sort of pretrial for someone who is accused of a likelihood of committing a hate crime in the future certainly would not pass constitutional muster, I don't think. The only kind of analog to this in American law that I can think of is the ability to get a restraining order against someone. In a sense, I'm worried that you're going to do something in the future. Now, in the case of a restraining order, that thing in the future is violence, not mere speech. It's generally predicated on proving some kind of misbehavior in the past, although not always, I will grant. But a restraining order also is relatively narrowly tailored. So it's like you can't go within 1,000 feet of this person, let's say, which is a much smaller infringement on someone's liberty than the measures that the Canadian law contemplates, which include effectively house arrest, wearing an ankle bracelet, for some reason not being allowed to drink alcohol, and having to submit your blood to blood tests. I'm not sure how that prevents hate crimes. You can tell me whether this would pass muster under Canada's constitutional protections, which I am much less familiar with than those in the United States. I've seen some indications that there would at least be disputes raised and adjudicated, but I don't know how they would be resolved. Do you?
Even in Canada, which has lower free speech protections than in the United States, it's very difficult to see how this would pass constitutional muster, especially the future crime, or as you more correctly call it, being more of a Philip K. Dick expert, pre-crime. And of course, unfortunately, this summons to mind Tom Cruise, about whom everybody has their own views. But could you explain a little bit how the pre-crime thing works? Because it isn't quite that they throw you in the slammer if they're worried that like you're going to misgender somebody or talk about how much you hate Uzbeks. But it's something more nuanced than that. Could you talk about what happens if you're suspected of future crime?
As I recall it from memory, it requires a kind of sign-off from, I believe it was the Attorney General, but some kind of government official. And this allows a provincial judge, is that the right word for it, to convene a hearing. To convene a hearing with the accused, as it were, and the accuser, I suppose would be called the complainant, and then at that point, the process seems to look a lot like the kind of process that you would go through for a restraining order, but instead of saying, you can't go within this number of feet, or I have a fear that this person is going to come and harass me because they've been doing it in the past or something. It's whether there's a likelihood that they're going to commit a hate crime in the future. Now, you could imagine a little bit of overlap between the category of things that you could call hate crime and the category of things that you could call harassment. So you could plausibly get a restraining order in the United States, or I imagine in Canada, if someone kept coming to your house late at night and knocking on the door and yelling racial slurs at you, right? You could get a restraining order for that. That would meet the definition of hate crime under this law. And so there's a little sliver of overlap where if that were all we were talking about, it would probably be uncontroversial and pass legal muster. But the way that hate crime is defined under the Online Harms Act, it can be mere speech. It can even be mere speech that isn't even uttered in person, and so could be construed by some stretch as fighting words. It can be mere speech that is only online. And so this provision would seem to apply to someone who I had a reasonable suspicion that they would denigrate me at some point in the future on Twitter. Now, I can think of a number of people who I have a strong suspicion who will denigrate me at some point in the future on Twitter. The idea that I could bring them before a judge, maybe. But, they've denigrated me on Twitter in the past. I'm likely to write things on the same topic that causes them to be so upset in the future. It just seems preposterous to me that I could bring them before a judge and and somehow say, look, this is probably going to happen again.
In fairness, it would have to be, they'd have to denigrate you on the basis of race, religion, gender, or analogous grounds. It couldn't just be, oh, there's another crap column from Conor or another crap interview from John Kay. It would have to be, there's another crap interview from John Kay, that notorious Jew, or something like that.
Privileged cis white man, right? That incorporates race.
By the way, this is, as you make clear in the article, it's at an early stage. I won't bog people down with the legislative protocols in Canada, but there's a first reading, there's a second reading, there's a third reading. We have this, what passes for a Senate here that gets involved, and then the Governor General signs off. But could I ask you about the reaction to this column? To the extent Atlantic writers get any reaction when they write about Canada. Like, did people say, oh, Conor, you must be mistaken, this must be Belarus or something like that? Like, Canada's a liberal democracy? Like, were people weirded out by what you were reporting?
The piece actually did relatively well. I didn't look at the traffic numbers, but
Canadian clicks. Maybe it's Canadian, because Canadians love when Americans write about them, even when it's a shanda like this. Like, they even like when Americans are writing negative things because they're getting attention from Americans.
But you were saying, in fairness, it would have to be denigrating on the basis of a protected characteristic, and there is this other caveat that I mentioned in passing that. There's a bit of a check on this in that before it gets to the stage of the judge, there has to be some other government official that signs off on this sort of proceeding. That's good insofar as it would, it presumably wouldn't be in as rampant use. On the other hand, when I think of the kinds of people who need protection from something like a restraining order, it generally isn't the most high-profile cases you can think of who have access to a government minister who's going to sign off. It's kind of the relatively powerless people that you would worry about the most. And, the idea of a kind of, a partisan party official signing off on which ones of these things to allow to go to the pre-crime trial phase, to me is alarming in its own right, especially in the context of, we're talking about a law where what is hate speech, what is genocide for that matter, it could hardly be more contested than it is right now. I mean, we literally have two rival camps in the Israel-Palestine conflict who are insisting that the other camp is guilty of genocide, is guilty of supporting genocide. We have these phrases like globalize the Intifada and from the river to the sea that some people believe to be genocidal phrases, and that other people say, no, of course, those aren't genocidal phrases. And you have, IDF officials or, far-right political figures in Israel saying things that seem a lot like we want to kill all the Palestinians. And then those kind of most extreme of the Israeli statements get maybe retweeted by someone in Canada. Is that sufficient to, get penalized under this law? It seems like it's taking one of the most contested, hotly contested subjects in the world at the moment and raising the prospect that you'll go to prison possibly for life for saying it. And one question, as I got reactions, I didn't get a ton of pushback. I didn't get a ton of people saying, no, this law is good. What I got was some people thought that my piece was too alarmist, and that, they said, look, this still has to go through a second reading. This government could fall before it even passes. And then at that point, it's going to go through court review. It could be challenged. And, all that's correct. I think that I wrote about it, or at least intended and tried to write about it in a way that was like, this is a proposal. This is not the law already. And so, all those things go along with it. It's not necessarily going to become the law. Legal challenges will be brought, I'm sure. But I tried to focus the piece, at the end at least, on, look, I think someone who supports this, even if it doesn't become law, if you champion this bit of legislation, I don't know that you can be trusted with power in a liberal democracy. It just seems to cross such extreme lines to me. Like, pre-crime is not a line we want to cross, nor is life imprisonment for mere speech. And, I could have written a much longer piece that delved into the many significant different pieces of this legislation, because I have other objections to some of the to some other parts of it. But those are quite complex areas of law. Like, what are the platforms going to be compelled to do with some kinds of content by the government? They're complicated, evolving questions, and I think reasonable people disagree about them. And I might have a particular point of view about how these things ought to be adjudicated, but I'm not going to say that anyone who disagrees with me isn't fit for government. On the other hand, the pre-crime stuff and the life imprisonment for mere speech, these seem to me just so extreme, and I don't understand why, in this moment when there's so much alarm about fascism, about democracy, and we need to protect democracy. These seem like the kinds of tools that would terrify people if Donald Trump were to say that he was going to start wielding them. It's certainly not unimaginable that if this law were to pass sometime in the near future, there would be a right-leaning government in Canada that used it in ways that the left hated. It's just it's baffling to me that on a high-profile piece of legislation that at least one high-profile member of Justin Trudeau's government is flogging on Twitter to this day, that that these extreme things would be a part of it, and not many people would pay attention and say this is madness.